The U.S. has targeted a Syrian airbase in the western Homs province with nearly 60 cruise missiles. The attack on Asharat airbase was launched from 2 U.S. warships in the Mediterranean Sea. Syrian authorities say 5 people have been killed and 7 others wounded in the strike. They say the attack caused civilian casualties in villages near the airbase. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the strike almost destroyed the base. Pentagon says Washington had warned Moscow ahead of the attack to minimize risk to Russian personnel located at the airfield. U.S. defense officials say the attack was a one-off, meaning it was expected to be a single strike with no current plans for escalation. U.S. President Donald Trump says the strike was in response to what he calls the Syrian government's recent chemical attack in Idlib province.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons. Tonight I call on all civilized nations to join us in seeking to end the slaughter and bloodshed in Syria, and also to end terrorism.
Donald Trump added that the war in Syria has destabilized the Middle East and threatens the U.S. and its allies. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson also said that the strike was proportionate and shows Trump's willingness to act when countries cross the line. He noted that the U.S. did not seek Russia's approval for the measure. The attack comes as the Syrian government rejects using chemical weapons in Idlib and condemns foreign-backed militants for stockpiling chemicals. Russia had earlier warned against apportioning blame until an investigation is carried out. The governor of Syria's Homs province says the U.S. missile strikes targeting a provincial airbase only serves the objectives of terrorist groups.
This attack will not prevent us from continuing fighting terrorism. We are not surprised to see America and Israel supporting this terrorism. It was an attack aimed at hitting the infrastructure in Syria and the Syrian people. It was part of the same aggression that targeted Syria more than once and in more than one place.
Barazi said the Syrian army used the targeted airbase for its operations against the Daesh terrorist group. The Homs governor underlined that Syria's leadership and policy will not change after the U.S. attack and that Damascus will continue its campaign against terror. He said those wounded in the attack are being taken to hospital. In the meantime, foreign-backed militants have hailed the U.S. missile strikes and called for further military action by Washington against Syria's military capabilities. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also said in a Twitter message that the U.S. missile strike sent a strong and clear message that the use of chemical weapons will not be tolerated. Netanyahu said Tel Aviv fully supports U.S. President Donald Trump's decision. Britain, Australia and Saudi Arabia have also welcomed the attack. Iran has categorically condemned the United States' deadly missile strikes on a Syrian airbase. Foreign Ministry spokesman Bahram Qasemi said such unilateral moves are, quote, dangerous, destructive and against international law. He said carrying out missile attacks under the pretext that Damascus used chemical weapons will only strengthen terrorists and further complicate the situation in Syria and the whole region. In the meantime, the head of the Defense Committee of the Russian Upper House of Parliament said Moscow will call for an urgent UN Security Council meeting on the incident. Viktor Ozerov said the U.S. strike could undermine efforts to fight terrorism in Syria, dismissing the attack as an act of aggression. Well, for more insight into the story, we talked to Syed Mohammad Marandi, university professor and political analyst, who is right here in the Iranian capital, Tehran. Mr. Marandi, thank you so much for being with us. What are your thoughts and opinions on this U.S. missile attack, which is considered the first direct military involvement by the United States inside Syria?
Well, it's not the first involvement. The United States already has forces in the country, and it is carrying out airstrikes. It has been carrying out airstrikes with impunity for years now, all against international law. And of course, indirectly, the United States, by supporting extremist organizations, funding them and giving them weapons, and of course helping its regional allies support other extremist groups, it is deeply involved in Syria. But this is another crime committed by the U.S. government. It is another violation of international law. Of course, there's no proof whatsoever that the Syrian government carried out chemical attacks. There has been no investigation. Obviously, the Americans don't want an investigation for obvious reasons. And when the Americans and the Western media, which is cheerleading this crime, when they speak about previous attacks, in fact, the 2013 attack, which they allude to, shows no evidence that the Syrian government carried out that attack either. According to the MIT report, the Syrian government couldn't have carried out that attack. And UN officials such as Carla de Ponte, she also back then said that the Syrian government probably didn't carry out the attack, and that there's evidence that the opposition did. So what the United States did in the past was to smear the Syrian government in order to help the extremists, and now the United States has struck a military airbase that is used to strike against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And it's for that reason that regimes like Saudi Arabia and the Israeli regime support the attack, because they too have been supporting Al-Qaeda, both countries, and both countries, the Saudis have directly supported ISIS, and the Israelis have definitely shown that they do not want ISIS to be defeated. That's what heads of think tanks as well as senior government officials have said before.
I'm going to continue on what you just mentioned, pick up the same line. The countries that have been supporting and rejoicing over the attack, Britain, Australia, Saudi Arabia, not to forget, of course, Israel, with the Israeli Prime Minister reacting to it personally, and Turkey. We just had the Turkish Deputy Prime Minister who has said that the Syrian government must be fully punished in international arena. What do you think that says about which countries benefit from the collapse of the Syrian government and the fall apart of the country?
Well, the reality is that the real criminal is not President Bashar Assad. He is a saint compared to people like Obama, Netanyahu, and the Turkish president, as well as the dictatorships in oil-rich Arab countries. These are the countries that from the beginning have supported the extremists. These are the countries and the Western media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, all of them from the very beginning, they were depicting the extremists as moderates and peace-loving freedom fighters. But now the evidence is coming out. The documents, the National Defense Agency document, WikiLeaks documents are showing that from very early on, the United States and its regional allies and the Europeans knew that these were extremists, and they were using it to destroy Syria because Syria was not in line with their policies. So obviously this attack, which is completely unjustified, there has been no evidence that the Syrian government carried out any chemical attack. This attack was carried out in order to strengthen extremists, strengthen Al-Qaeda in Idlib, strengthen ISIS in its fight against the Syrian government, strengthen the Israeli regime, as well as strengthen the position of regimes like Saudi Arabia. But again, the important point to remember is that from the beginning of this conflict, there has never been any evidence whatsoever that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons. Not now and not in years past. In fact, the United States took away the Syrian government's chemical weapons in 2003 in an agreement. So, and also, if the Americans are really worried that this air base was where chemical weapons were taken by planes to bomb targets, then why did they bomb the air base? By bombing the air base, they could actually cause a catastrophe with chemical weapons in the whole region around the air base. So obviously the Americans knew that they were not targeting chemical weapons, and they only destroyed the air base to support the extremists. And I think people should ignore the narratives coming out of the Western media altogether.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Sayyid Muhammad Marandi, university professor and political analyst, joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran.